When Jesus turned towards Jerusalem for the final time, he knew he was going to his death. Some of his disciples agreed. "Let's go with him so we can die there too," said Thomas. The date is the turn of the month from March to April of the year 33 in our reckoning. More importantly, it was Passover time, one of the great national celebrations in the Jewish calendar then and now, a reminder of how God had rescued the enslaved Hebrews from the Egyptians and sent them on their way to their own promised land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And for more than living memory of those attending Passover in the year 33, a land now occupied by the Romans. Crowds of pilgrims poured into the city, and the local Roman commander, Pontius Pilate, came up from his coastal headquarters at Caesarea Maritima, along with some genuine Roman soldiers to reinforce the local auxiliaries. Jesus first goes to Bethany, a suburb of Jerusalem, where he raises his dear friend Lazarus from an early grave. Much joy, but some saw that this sort of action could inflame an already volatile situation. Joseph Caiaphas, the Roman appointed high priest at the time, declared that it would be better for Jesus to die than for him to lead a rebellion that would bring about an inevitable defeat and the removal of the few remaining Jewish privileges, such as being allowed to celebrate Passover at the temple. And although Caiaphas did not say it, he must have known any failed uprising would cost him his job, perhaps even his life. From this point on, Jesus treads a very careful path. It is his intention to die at the time the Passover lambs were slaughtered. So when he enters the city on Sunday, the 29th of March, the day now traditionally known as Palm Sunday, Jesus could not afford to let the enthusiasm of the crowd boil over, as this would bring the Roman garrison out of their fortress adjacent to the temple. One can imagine a Roman sentry reporting to his centurion, who in turn asks one of the priests or other temple officials, "What is going on?" The priest knew that any attempt to arrest Jesus during one of these displays of public acclamation would see the situation get out of hand. Possibly the Romans were persuaded to see this as no more than over-exuberance on the part of some of the pilgrims and let the matter pass for now. Then Jesus enters the temple, looks around for a while, and then returns to Bethany before nightfall. If the revolution was about to start, it was not going to happen that day. Until he ate his final meal with his disciples in an upstairs room somewhere in Jerusalem, Jesus made sure he stayed in clear view in public spaces when he was surrounded by witnesses. It was not going to be possible for the temple authorities to seize him in Jerusalem by day. And at night, Jesus was far enough out of town to be relatively safe. A snatch squad sent out from Jerusalem after dark would probably not be able to find Jesus in Bethany before word reached him and he made himself scarce. What the authorities really needed was someone on the inside who could give them information as to where and when Jesus could be arrested away from his supporters, and they would be willing to pay for that information. But at this point in the story, no one was talking, or at least not yet, were they, Judas? So the next day, Monday, Jesus returns to Jerusalem, where he is confronted by a group of leading priests, elders, and scribes. They have a question for him. By what authority are you doing these things, or who gave you this authority to do them? Whenever Jesus taught in and around Galilee, it was noted that he had authority, not like the so-called experts, whose authority was always either an appeal to the Torah the written law given by God to Moses, or more frequently, an appeal to the experts of past times who had said something profound about the law, almost frightened to dare to give an opinion of their own. But Jesus had a unique authority. What he said rang true, and he backed it up by what he did and how he lived. This gave Jesus an innate credibility. The priests and religion experts could not compete. Perhaps their question was genuine. They really wanted to know how Jesus did what he did. But they were asking in the wrong way, trying to trick him into making a claim he could not back up. Jesus responds in an unexpected way. He answered their question with one of his own. Mark 11:29-33. Here it is in the Message Bible. Jesus responded, "First, let me ask you a question. Answer my question, and then I'll present my credentials. About the baptism of John, who authorized it? Heaven or humans? Tell me." They were on the spot and knew it. They pulled back into a huddle and whispered, "If we say heaven, he'll ask us why we didn't believe John. If we say humans, we'll be up against it with the people, because they all hold John up as a prophet." They decided to concede that round to Jesus. "We don't know," they said. Then Jesus replied, "Then I won't answer your question either." Whoops. The authorities thought they were going to be able to get the crowd to turn against Jesus, but their clumsy approach turned it into an own goal. The crowd were even more supportive of Jesus because of the respect they had for John the Baptizer. Jesus follows this with a parable to emphasize his point. The wicked tenants, or in some Bibles, the vineyard. Same story, different titles. This is in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And Matthew includes an extra story with two sons. Both are well worth hearing. Of course they are. They're parables by Jesus. But they're not what I want to discuss in this talk. So we will read and note them and perhaps come back for a more detailed examination another time. Matthew 21:28-46. I will read this in Tom Wright's New Testament for Everyone. "What do you think?" he went on. "Once upon a time there was a man who had two sons. He went to the first one and said, 'Now then, my boy, off you go and do a day's work in the vineyard.' 'Don't want to,' replied the son. But afterwards he thought better of it and went. He went to the other son and said the same thing. 'Certainly, master,' he said, but he didn't go. So which of the two did what his father wanted?' 'The first,' they answered. 'I'm telling you the truth,' Jesus said to them. 'The tax collectors and prostitutes are going into God's kingdom ahead of you. Yes, John came to you in accordance with God's righteous covenant plan, and you didn't believe him. But the tax collectors and prostitutes believed him. But when you saw it, you didn't think better of it afterwards and believe him.' Listen to another parable," Jesus went on. "Once upon a time there was a householder who planted a vineyard, built a wall for it, dug out a wine press in it, and built a tower. Then he let it out to tenant farmers and went away on a journey. When harvest time arrived, he sent his slaves to the farmers to collect his produce. The farmers seized his slaves, they beat one, killed another, and stoned another. Again he sent other slaves, more than before, and they treated them in the same way. Finally he sent his son to them. 'They'll respect my son,' he said. But the farmers saw the son. 'This fellow's the heir,' they said amongst themselves. 'Come on, let's kill him, and then we can take over the property.' So they seized him, threw him out of the vineyard, and killed him. Now then, when the vineyard owner returns, what will he do to those farmers?' 'He'll kill them brutally, the wretches,' they said, 'and he'll lease the vineyard to other farmers who'll give him the produce at the right time.' 'Did you never read what the Bible says?' said Jesus to them. 'The stone the builders threw away is now atop the corner. It's from the Lord, all this, they say, and we looked on in wonder. So then, let me tell you this. God's kingdom is going to be taken away from you and given to a nation that will produce the goods. Anyone who falls on this stone will be smashed to pieces, and anyone it falls on will be crushed. When the chief priests and the Pharisees heard his parables, they knew he was talking about them. They tried to arrest him, but they were afraid of the crowds, who regarded him as a prophet. So the opponents of Jesus, an unholy alliance of different factions, including priests, scribes, and others, realize they have to find a way of negating his popular support. If Jesus says something controversial, then the crowds might not make a fuss if he's taken in for questioning. Or perhaps Jesus can be made to say something to which the Romans will object, something treasonous, or something that can be made to sound treasonous. Maybe not enough to have Jesus executed, but of sufficient interest for the Romans to take him in for questioning, which would take Jesus out of circulation until the Passover was concluded, and perhaps even forever. So next into battle are a mixed group of Pharisees and Herodians. Pharisees were the strict observers of the Jewish religious laws and, in general, were respected by the ordinary people, although perhaps not liked. They kept the law better than the rest of us and were not slow to point out the failings of others. They were not wrong in what they said, but perhaps wrong in how they said it, if you know what I mean. The Herodians were probably members of the court of the Tetrarch Herod Antipas, a son of the last king of the Jews, King Herod. When this first Herod died, the Romans split up his kingdom in order to divide and rule. Antipas was made Tetrarch, ruler of a quarter, in this case the regions of Galilee up north and Perea on the east bank of the Jordan. Elsewhere, we read about how some members of Antipas's household were sympathetic to Jesus, but we assume that the Herodians who came to question him in this incident were at best neutral and quite possibly hostile. Certainly, the question they asked was intended to catch out Jesus, and probably the way it was asked was in a tone of, "Well, if you're so smart, what do you think about this then?" Mark 12:14 and 15. Teacher, we know that you are true and do not care about anyone's opinion, for you are not swayed by appearances, but truly teach the way of God. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Should we pay them or should we not? Note the hypocrisy behind the question. You truly teach the way of God. If they really believed that, then they would not be trying to catch him out. If Jesus was to say, yes, pay your taxes to Caesar, then he would lose standing with the people, who would accuse him of being a pro-Roman appeaser. But were Jesus to say that taxes should be withheld, then the Romans would be keen to ask him to explain himself in an interrogation cell up at the castle. So is Jesus an anti-Roman nationalist, a man of the people? Or is he a pro-Roman compromiser, a political realist like the priests? Jesus, as usual, seizes the initiative and does something unexpected. He asks to see one of the tribute coins. Almost certainly it would be a silver denarius. These coins were about the same size as a modern 5-pence piece, although slightly thicker. On one side, Caesar Tiberius was shown wearing the laurel Stephanos, the crown of victory. On the reverse, the goddess Irene, peace, Roman propaganda. By AD 33, the 19th year of the reign of Tiberius, there were millions of these coins in circulation, all coming from the Lugdunum mint in Gaul. That's Lyon in France today. So Jesus asked to see one of the offending coins. Surely he knew what or who was on it, so he must be asking to see one to make a point. Who had a denarius to hand? In monetary terms, it would be like me asking if anyone can show me a £50 note. Not everybody has that amount of cash on them. So my guess is that it was one of the Pharisees or Herodians who had the coin with them. They were the ones buying into the system. Poor people did not habitually carry the emperor's portrait on a coin because they could not, as they did not have that type of money. They were more likely to be carrying a pruta coin made of copper, the one often described as a mite, smaller than a denarius, not as shiny, and worth just a fraction. In modern terms, if a denarius was a £50 note, a pruta was a 50p piece. It was the rich that had the big money because they had bought into the system. If you carry the currency, then you have to pay the price. And note the second part of the answer Jesus gave. Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. So pay your taxes. Sorry, but I think that's what Jesus means. And do not forget that God asks for what is his, which is everything. Remember what Jesus says elsewhere about not having two masters, and that we must choose between serving God and money. This is what is important. The people understood this and were amazed. We are back in the question about authority. Jesus had it, and his answer was ekfamoso, amazing, astounding. The crowd took the point, and the temple authorities were seething. So on to the next question. This one was asked by some Sadducees. Sadducees were a traditionalist movement, often priests, usually well-to-do. They were different to the Pharisees in accepting only the books of Moses as having authority. Pharisees believed that in addition to the books of Moses, the writings by and about the prophets were inspired, and also other writings such as Psalms. So the Pharisee Bible was the same as our Old Testament, except it was written in Hebrew. The Sadducee Bible was Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and that's all. So Pharisees read the prophets and the Psalms and realized that there was more to life than 70 and 10. But the Sadducees read the books of Moses and claimed that this was indeed all there was. God blessed the righteous here on earth as he did the great men of old, such as Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And for the Sadducees, that is it. No reward in heaven because there is no heaven. Imagine that, John Lennon. As one expert has pointed out, Sadducees were pleased with themselves and their life here and now in a way that can only occur to those rich enough to enjoy life to the full. So a question about a woman who had been widowed and remarried many times was a typical scholarly debating point between rabbis of Sadducean and Pharisaic backgrounds. What a clever riddle, they must think to themselves. Let's see you answer that one, Mr. Jesus. And of course, Jesus can answer this. He knows far more about the Torah, the law of Moses, than these fundamentalist scholars. Let us read the passage and the answer in Eugene Peterson's helpful paraphrase, The Message. Mark 12, 18-27. Some Sadducees, the party that denies any possibility of resurrection, came up and asked, Teacher, Moses wrote that if a man dies and leaves a wife but no child, his brother is obligated to marry the widow and have children. Well, there once were 7 brothers. The first took a wife. He died childless. The second married her. He died, and still no child. The same with the third. All 7 took their turn, but no child. Finally, the wife died. When they are raised at the resurrection, whose wife is she? All 7 were her husband. Jesus said, You're way off base, and here's why. One, you don't know what God said. Two, you don't know how God works. After the dead are raised up, we're past the marriage business. As it is with angels now, all our ecstasies and intimacies then will be with God. And regarding the dead, whether or not they are raised, don't you ever read the Bible? How God at the bush said to Moses, I am, not was, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. The living God is God of the living, not the dead. You're way, way off base. So while the Sadducees think they've come up with an unanswerable question, Jesus sees right through them and demolishes their whole philosophy with a proof straight out of their own holy books. God is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. When God introduced himself to Moses in the wilderness with these words, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had been dead for many years. But God was still their God, even though, according to the Sadducees, they were dead and gone after having been richly rewarded in life. Of course, part of what Jesus is saying is good old common sense, or wisdom if you prefer. If God is God, then he has the power to sort out any problem. Why should this whose wife is she anyway question be too difficult for God? And I think we can sense that Jesus is not impressed by this hypothetical case. If it was hypothetical, perhaps there was a real woman who had been a serial widow, passed on from one husband to the next. Seeing how God's good plan to care for the helpless, and back then widows really were at the bottom, how God's plan had been reduced to a neat little philosophical debating point must have angered Jesus. Like the Pharisees, the Sadducees were also lacking in compassion for the real life problems faced by real life people. And finally, glory be, an honest question. Mark 12:28 to 33. And one of the scribes came up and heard them disputing with one another, and seeing that he answered them well, asked him, which commandment is the most important of all? Jesus answered, the most important is, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is this, you shall love your neighbour as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. And the scribe said to him, you are right, teacher. You have truly said that he is one, and there is no other besides him, and to love him with all the heart, and with all the understanding, and with all the strength, and to love one's neighbour as oneself is much more important than all the whole burnt offerings and sacrifices. The scribes, those that made their living out of being able to read and write, do not always get a good press in the Gospels. Often they are bracketed with the Pharisees as being religiously conservative and unwilling to listen to Jesus. This unnamed scribe seems to be a passer-by rather than one of those sent to ask awkward questions. He asks a question that was often discussed in scholarly circles. Which is the most important commandment? The word here is protos, first, as in first position of importance, not the first to be given. Which is the prime commandment? Jesus gives a straight answer to a straight question, quoting directly from the scriptures. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is this, you shall love your neighbour as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. So not quite a straight question, or not quite a straight answer, as Jesus gives too. Perhaps they are inseparable. Can we love God without showing love for our neighbours? And if we love our neighbours as ourselves, then we are showing our love of God. The scribe is impressed. He does what all good scribes do and repeats the answer to make sure everyone is clear what it is, and then adds his own comment. You are right, teacher. You have truly said that he is one, and there is no other besides him. And to love him with all the heart, and with all the understanding, and with all the strength, and to love one's neighbour as oneself, is much more than all whole burnt offerings and sacrifices. So this scribe, recognizing that keeping the commandments is far more important than following the rituals of temple worship through animal sacrifice. And remember, they're in the temple, surrounded by those that think the temple is the be all and end all of their religion. This response from the scribe brings praise from Jesus. You are not far from the kingdom of God. We do not know how many Herodians, Pharisees, and Sadducees had been trying to get Jesus to say something controversial that day, but at least there was one who was prepared to listen, really listen, and whose mind was truly set on serving God. Can we say the same?